The morning sun over Jerusalem did not bring warmth to the high priest. It brought only the weight of the golden ephod and the heavy crown of responsibility. Joseph Caiaphas stood upon the stone balcony of his palace, his eyes scanning the bustling courtyards of the temple. For 18 years, he had sat upon the seat of religious authority, navigating the treacherous waters between the ancient laws of Moses and the iron fist of the Roman Empire. To the common man, he was the voice of God, but in the quiet of his own mind, he was an architect of survival. He knew that the peace he maintained was fragile, held together by compromises and the constant appeasement of the Roman prefect. One wrong move, one spark of rebellion, and the legions of Rome would turn the holy city into a graveyard. Caiaphas prided himself on his pragmatism, believing that the survival of the nation was worth any personal or moral cost. However, a new shadow had begun to stretch across the limestone walls of the city. Reports had been flooding into the Sanhedrin for months. Tales of a Galilean preacher named Jesus who walked among the commoners, speaking of a kingdom that was not of this world. To many, he was a healer, a man of miracles who gave sight to the blind and life back to the dead. To Caiaphas, he was something far more dangerous, a political incendiary. In a land occupied by Rome, a man who claimed to be a king, even a spiritual one, was a death sentence for everyone. The high priest watched the crowds growing larger, the whispers of Messiah becoming a roar that threatened to reach the ears of Pontius Pilate. Caiaphas did not see a holy man. He saw a catalyst for a Roman massacre that would end in the burning of the temple and the scattering of the Jewish people. Behind the closed, heavy doors of the Sanhedrin, the air was thick with the scent of incense and the tension of desperate men. Caiaphas looked upon the gathered elders, his voice cold and calculated. He did not speak of theology or prophecy. He spoke of the hard math of survival. He silenced the room with a single, chilling philosophy. It was better that one man should die for the people than that the whole nation should perish. It was a logic born of necessity, a sacrificial trade that would appease Rome and preserve the status quo. The greater good was his compass, and it pointed directly toward the elimination of the Galilean threat. The opportunity to strike came not through a grand battle, but through a whispered betrayal. Judas, a disillusioned follower of the preacher, was brought before Caiaphas in the dead of night. There was no warmth in their meeting, no shared ideals. It was a formal, sterile transaction. Caiaphas watched as the 30 pieces of silver were counted out, the metallic clinking of the coins sounding like the closing of a tomb. For the high priest, this was not a bribe for a sin. It was a payment for an essential service, a cold line item in the budget of national security. Judas was merely a tool, a means to an end that Caiaphas felt was divinely mandated by the preservation of Israel's remnant. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The night air in the Garden of Gethsemane was thick with the scent of olives and the impending sense of doom. Caiaphas waited in his courtyard, receiving the frantic reports as his temple guards returned with their prisoner. The arrest had been a chaotic affair, a midnight struggle beneath the flickering light of torches, but the objective had been achieved. Jesus was brought before him in the deep hours of the night, a move designed to bypass the public's fervor and the risk of a riot. Standing in the center of the high priest's palace, the Galilean remained hauntingly silent. Caiaphas paced before him, his frustration mounting as the prisoner refused to defend himself against the accusations of the witnesses. "Lie!" the high priest demanded an answer under oath. When the words of blasphemy finally left the prisoner's lips, Caiaphas tore his robes in a practiced display of outrage. The fate of the man was sealed, and the machinery of the empire was now set in motion. As the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon, Caiaphas looked out from his balcony, convinced that the blood on his hands was the price of peace, unaware that the sequence he had ignited would soon consume everything he had ever sought to protect. The verdict within the walls of the Sanhedrin was merely the first movement in a complex political symphony. As the sun climbed higher over the Judean hills, Caiaphas knew that religious condemnation was not enough. To truly extinguish the Galilean spark without inciting a populist revolt, the hand of Rome had to pull the lever of execution. The high priest orchestrated the transfer of the prisoner to the praetorium, the fortress of the Roman prefect. This was the most delicate maneuver of his long career. Caiaphas stood outside the pagan dwelling to avoid ritual defilement, sending his demands across the threshold to Pontius Pilate. The tension between the two men was palpable. Pilate, a man of iron and ego, loathed being a tool for Jewish religious disputes, but Caiaphas understood the prefect's greatest weakness, his fear of Caesar. With calculated precision, the high priest exerted pressure, hinting that any hesitation to punish a self-proclaimed king would be viewed in Rome as a betrayal of the emperor. He forced Pilate's hand, turning a local theological conflict into a matter of imperial treason. When the Roman official finally washed his hands and surrendered the prisoner to the cross, Caiaphas felt a grim sense of triumph. The empire had validated his judgment, and the threat to the status quo was being neutralized by the very power he had spent 18 years appeasing. As the afternoon sky began to bruise with an unnatural, suffocating darkness, the victory felt increasingly hollow. Caiaphas retreated into the sanctuary of the temple, the massive golden gates shutting out the murmurs of the trembling city. He sat in the shadows of the inner chambers, attempting to ignore the frantic reports brought by the priests. They spoke of the earth shuddering and the massive ornate veil of the temple, the thick tapestry that separated the holy from the profane, tearing violently from top to bottom. It was an omen that struck at the heart of his authority. Outside, the sky was black as midnight at noon, yet the high priest remained resolute in his denial. He dismissed the celestial signs as mere atmospheric anomalies, refusing to acknowledge that the foundations of his world were cracking. He had sacrificed the man to save the temple, but the tearing of the veil suggested that the temple itself was no longer the exclusive dwelling of the divine. He stayed in the dark, clutching his scrolls and his pride, waiting for the sun to return so he could restore order to a world that felt suddenly, terrifyingly alien. The weekend brought no peace, only a new crisis that threatened to undo everything the crucifixion had accomplished. On the third day, the guards stationed at the tomb arrived at the high priest's palace, their faces pale and their voices trembling with an impossible story. They spoke of a blinding light and an empty sepulchre. Instead of wonder, Caiaphas felt a cold, creeping dread. If the people believed the Galilean had conquered death, the movement would become an unstoppable fire. There was no room for miracles in his pragmatic world, only the management of perception. Caiaphas acted quickly, reaching into the temple treasury to produce large sums of gold. He bribed the Roman soldiers to spread a fabricated report that the disciples had stolen the body under the cover of night. This campaign of suppression was his desperate attempt to bury the truth beneath a mountain of silver. Yet the more he tried to silence the story, the louder the whispers grew. He had killed the man, but he was beginning to realize that he could not kill the memory. In the months that followed, the high priest's paranoia deepened as he watched the rise of the apostles. These unlettered men from Galilee, once terrified and scattered, now stood boldly in the temple colonnades, performing wonders and speaking with a fire that Caiaphas could not extinguish. He ordered floggings and issued threats, but his series of failed suppressions only served to highlight his waning control. The movement, now called the Way, was spreading through the narrow alleys of Jerusalem like a slow-moving tide. Caiaphas found himself trapped in a cycle of escalating violence and frustration. The greater good was slipping through his fingers, and the very peace he had sought to preserve by blood was being destabilized by a message of resurrection that ignored his edicts. The political ground beneath his feet began to shift with the arrival of Lucius Vitellius, the governor of Syria. For years, Caiaphas had survived by maintaining a delicate balance of power, but the wind was changing. Roman favor was a fickle thing, and Vitellius was not interested in the old alliances. The governor arrived in Jerusalem during the Passover, and his presence signaled a new era of imperial oversight. The protection Caiaphas had cultivated with previous officials dissolved as Roman interest turned toward his rivals. The high priest, who had once manipulated the empire, now found himself under its scrutinizing gaze. The end of his long reign came with a sudden, humiliating swiftness. In a public decree that stunned the city, Vitellius deposed Caiaphas from the high priesthood. After 18 years of dominance, he was stripped of the authority that had defined his existence. He was forced to hand over the sacred, heavy vestments, the golden plates and the blue robes, to his successor. Now a civilian in a city that was beginning to boil with the very rebellion he had feared, Caiaphas found himself an outsider in his own temple. It was during this time of exile that he discovered a secret letter from a contact in the Roman administration. The message was chilling. The harsh measures Rome was planning to implement against Judea were more brutal than anything he had imagined. The peace he had killed to protect was a lie. The legions were preparing for a conflict that would shatter the nation he thought he had saved. Living as a ghost within the walls of a city he once ruled, Caiaphas spent his final years watching the slow evaporation of his legacy. The former high priest, now a man of shadows, observed from his private estate as the very forces he had sacrificed his soul to suppress began to consume the horizon. The followers of the Way, those persistent echoes of the Galilean, did not wither under the sun of his successor's indifference. Instead, they multiplied in the marketplaces and secret rooms. Their conviction, a silent rebuke to the pragmatism that had defined Caiaphas's life. He walked through the temple courts not as a sovereign, but as a relic, ignored by the young zealots who spoke of war and holy fire. He saw the radicalization of the youth, the sharpening of daggers in the dark, and the mounting defiance against the Roman eagle. Every decree he had once signed to keep the peace was now being torn to shreds by a generation that had no memory of the delicate balance he had brokered. The storm he had spent 18 years trying to delay finally broke in the year 66 AD. The Great Revolt exploded with a fury that left no room for the measured diplomacy of the old priesthood. Caiaphas, now aged and weary, witnessed the chaos from his balcony as Jerusalem transformed into a furnace of sectarian violence and revolutionary fervor. His greater good philosophy was revealed to be a tragic delusion. The one man he had handed over to the Romans to save the nation had not been enough to sate the appetite of history. The peace he had bought with 30 pieces of silver and a midnight trial was incinerated in the first weeks of the uprising. He saw the Roman legions, led by Cestius Gallus and later Vespasian, beginning their slow, methodical strangulation of the Judean hills. The irony was a bitter ash in his mouth. The very Roman intervention he had killed to prevent was now the inevitable end of everything he loved. As the siege tightened and the sounds of battering rams echoed against the limestone walls, Caiaphas became a prisoner of the catastrophe he had helped architect. The one-man prophecy he had once uttered with such cold confidence returned to haunt his final reflections. He had believed that by destroying Jesus, he was preserving the temple and the people. Yet, as he looked toward the sanctuary, he saw the smoke of infighting rising from the holy courts. The Romans he had once manipulated to execute a preacher were now surrounding the city to execute a nation. He lived long enough to see the inner circle of the temple become a fortress for rebels, their blood staining the floors he had once walked in ritual purity. Alone in his final hours, stripped of his robes, his titles, and his hope, the former high priest faced the ultimate silence. He died as the world he knew was being reduced to rubble, his breath failing just as the first fires began to lick the golden gates of the temple. He was buried in haste, a discarded statesman of a collapsing era, while the center of his universe was leveled until not one stone remained upon another. The memory of Caiaphas was swallowed by the dust of centuries until a morning in 1990, when a construction crew working in a forest south of the old city of Jerusalem accidentally broke through the roof of a burial cave. Among the limestone ossuaries, one stood out for its intricate carvings and the name etched into its side: Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Within the box lay the bones of a man who had reached for the levers of history and found them made of glass. The discovery was a sensation, providing the world with the cold, hard physical evidence of the man who had presided over the trial of the century. Yet the ornate box was empty of its power, a silent testament to the ultimate futility of his political maneuvers. History's verdict remained unchanged. Caiaphas was no longer the protector of the law or the savior of the people. He was forever preserved as the architect of the ultimate betrayal. The empty, weathered ossuary remains a monument to the man who tried to control the divine plan through human cruelty, only to be consumed by the very tragedy he thought he could outrun.